There's one mistake, just one, out of everything a person could possibly do, that a super empath will not come back from. Not because she's incapable of forgiveness in general, not because she's become cold or hardened or unable to extend grace the way she once did so easily, so freely, to almost anyone who asked for it. It's because this particular mistake doesn't just hurt her. It confirms something she spent years, sometimes an entire lifetime, hoping wasn't true. If you've ever watched a super empath walk away from someone permanently, calmly, without the dramatic confrontation you might have expected given everything that led up to it, you've likely witnessed the aftermath of exactly this mistake. And if you've ever wondered what specific line someone crossed to produce that particular unshakable finality, the kind of ending that no apology, no grand gesture, no amount of time seems capable of softening, today we're going to name it directly. The one emotional mistake a super empath never forgives is this: being deliberately, knowingly lied to about something she trusted enough to stop verifying. Let me explain exactly what this means, because the distinction buried inside this sentence is the entire key to understanding why this specific betrayal cuts so much deeper and lasts so much longer than almost any other harm a super empath might experience throughout her life. Every empath, at some point in her healing journey, develops what we might call earned trust, a specific, hard won willingness to stop verifying, stop double checking, stop quietly gathering evidence about someone's honesty because that person has demonstrated consistently, over real time, that this level of vigilance is no longer necessary. This isn't naive trust, the kind offered automatically, without discernment, to anyone who seems charming or convincing. This is trust that had to be earned through sustained, demonstrated reliability. Trust that a genuinely healed empath extends carefully, deliberately, only after enough evidence has accumulated to justify finally letting her guard down in a specific relationship. This earned trust represents something enormously significant in a super empath's psychology, something worth understanding fully before we can understand why its violation produces such a permanent, unforgivable wound. Remember everything we've discussed in previous conversations about what it actually costs an empath to develop discernment after surviving manipulation. The years of learning to distinguish performance from authenticity, the painful process of rebuilding self-trust after having her own perception gaslit and undermined, the deliberate, effortful work of learning to extend vulnerability selectively rather than indiscriminately. When a super empath finally decides to stop verifying someone, to relax the vigilance she's worked so hard to develop, she's not doing this casually. She's making a significant psychological investment, one built on real evidence, real consistency, real demonstrated trustworthiness over meaningful time. This decision represents her placing something precious and hard-won, the discernment that protects her from repeating past harm, into someone else's hands, trusting that they'll honor it rather than exploit exactly the vulnerability this trust creates. This is precisely what makes deliberate deception, delivered specifically into this space of earned trust, so uniquely devastating. It's not simply a lie, it's a violation of the exact mechanism she rebuilt, often at enormous cost, in order to be able to trust anyone again at all. Here's why this distinction matters so much more than it might initially seem. If someone lies to a super empath before this trust has been established, during an early stage of a relationship, before she's extended the kind of vulnerable, unverified trust we're describing, the lie, while still painful, doesn't actually threaten the deeper psychological structure we're discussing. It confirms, disappointingly but not devastatingly, that this particular person wasn't trustworthy, information she can absorb and use to inform her decisions moving forward. Her broader capacity for trust, her broader belief that some people can genuinely be trusted once they've demonstrated it consistently, remains intact. But when the lie comes after trust has been earned, after she's specifically, deliberately chosen to stop verifying because the evidence seemed to genuinely support doing so, something different happens entirely. The lie doesn't just reveal that this specific person wasn't trustworthy, it threatens something far more foundational. Her belief that earned trust, the kind built through demonstrated consistency over meaningful time, actually means anything at all. It suggests that even careful, evidence-based discernment can be successfully exploited, that the entire system she rebuilt after previous harm, the system specifically designed to protect her from repeating past mistakes, can still be defeated by someone patient enough to perform consistency long enough to earn access to her guard being fully down. This is precisely why this specific mistake produces something categorically different from ordinary hurt or disappointment. It produces something closer to a crisis of methodology, a genuine, disorienting question about whether the entire framework she's built for protecting herself while still remaining capable of genuine connection actually works at all, or whether it simply represents a more sophisticated version of the same vulnerability that got exploited before she developed any discernment whatsoever. Understanding why this specific violation produces such profound, lasting damage requires understanding one more crucial element: the specific role earned trust plays in a super empath's overall sense of safety in the world. For someone who has survived significant manipulation, who has done the extensive work of developing discernment, learning to distinguish performance from authenticity, and gradually rebuilding capacity for genuine vulnerability, earned trust isn't simply a pleasant feature of a good relationship. It's evidence, hard-won and precious, that her recovery actually worked. It's proof that she's not permanently doomed to either complete guardedness or complete vulnerability, that there's a genuine middle path available where careful discernment eventually produces real, safe, deserved trust. When this earned trust gets deliberately violated, the damage extends far beyond the immediate relationship. It threatens this larger, more important piece of evidence about her own healing and her own capacity to navigate the world safely. This is why the response to this specific betrayal so rarely looks like ordinary anger or ordinary grief. It looks like something closer to a fundamental recalibration, a permanent structural change in how she approaches trust going forward, one that the person who violated it almost never anticipates and almost never fully understands, precisely because they don't understand what they actually broke when they chose deception over honesty in exactly the space where she'd finally, carefully, deliberately let her guard down. Let's talk about what actually happens once this specific betrayal occurs, because the aftermath reveals something crucial that distinguishes it from every other kind of hurt a super empath might experience and eventually recover from. Here's the first thing that becomes noticeable almost immediately to anyone who witnesses this specific kind of ending. There's no negotiation phase. With most conflicts, even significant ones, there's typically some period of discussion, explanation, attempted repair, a back and forth where both people try to understand what happened and whether the relationship can survive it. This negotiation phase exists because most hurts, even painful ones, still leave room for genuine dialogue about context, intention, and possible paths forward. This specific betrayal skips that phase almost entirely, and understanding why reveals something important about what actually happened internally. Because the violation wasn't simply about the specific lie itself, whatever its content happened to be. It was about what the lie revealed regarding the entire foundation the relationship had been operating on. Once that foundation is revealed to have been false, there's no longer a stable ground from which negotiation could actually occur. Every subsequent conversation, every explanation offered, every plea for understanding, has to be evaluated through the exact lens that just proved itself capable of being deceived. Her own trust, her own perception, her own judgment about who deserves continued access to her. This is precisely why attempts at explanation or reconciliation following this specific betrayal so often fail completely, regardless of how genuine or well-intentioned they might actually be. It's not that a super empath becomes incapable of hearing explanation. It's that the mechanism she would normally use to evaluate whether an explanation is trustworthy has just been demonstrated conclusively to be exploitable. She's no longer simply deciding whether to believe this specific explanation. She's confronting the more fundamental question of whether her capacity to distinguish truth from convincing performance actually functions reliably at all, given that it just failed in exactly the relationship where she trusted it most. This explains something that often confuses and hurts the person who committed this specific betrayal once they realize the full weight of what's happened. Their sincere, even desperate attempts at accountability afterward frequently produce no visible softening whatsoever, regardless of how genuine that accountability might actually be. This isn't cruelty or unforgiving rigidity on her part. It's the direct, unavoidable consequence of what actually broke. You cannot use the same tool that just failed catastrophically to evaluate whether it's now working again. The very mechanism required to assess sincere accountability was the mechanism that just got exploited, which means every subsequent attempt at reconciliation has to pass through a filter that's now permanently, appropriately more cautious than it was before this specific violation occurred. There's something else worth understanding about why this particular mistake produces such lasting consequences, something that goes beyond the immediate relationship into how a super empath understands her own emotional history moving forward. Because this specific betrayal doesn't just damage the current relationship, it retroactively contaminates her memory of every moment that led up to it, every instance where she felt genuinely safe, genuinely connected, genuinely secure in her decision to extend trust. Those moments don't simply remain positive memories that happen to precede a painful ending. They become suspect, requiring re-examination through the lens of what she now knows, that at least some portion of what felt authentic was actually calculated deception. This retroactive contamination is one of the most psychologically exhausting aspects of this specific betrayal, because it requires her to essentially reprocess an entire history, sorting through what was genuine and what wasn't, without ever having complete confidence in her ability to make that distinction accurately anymore. This is fundamentally different from grieving a relationship that simply ended, where the positive memories remain positive even as the relationship itself concludes. Here, the positive memories themselves become the site of ongoing uncertainty, which explains why this specific kind of grief often takes so much longer to fully resolve than grief over relationships that ended through more ordinary means. Here's something crucial to understand about how this affects future relationships, because it explains a pattern that might otherwise seem disproportionate or overly cautious to people observing from the outside. A super empath who has experienced this specific betrayal doesn't simply become more careful with the person who committed it. She often develops a genuinely different relationship with the entire concept of earned trust itself, one that requires significantly more evidence, significantly more time, and significantly more consistency before she's willing to extend that same unverified vulnerability again to anyone, regardless of how trustworthy they might genuinely be. This isn't irrational overcaution, even though it might initially appear that way to people who haven't experienced this specific kind of violation themselves. It's a direct, logical response to having discovered that her previous method for determining when trust was safely earned proved insufficient to actually protect her. Recalibrating that method, requiring more evidence, extending the timeline before full vulnerability becomes available again, represents genuine wisdom rather than excessive fear, even though the practical effect might look from the outside like someone who has simply become harder to reach. This recalibration matters enormously for anyone hoping to build genuine intimacy with a super empath who has survived this specific kind of betrayal in her history, because it means patience and consistency matter more than intensity or grand romantic gestures. The evidence she now requires isn't dramatic proof of devotion delivered in isolated, memorable moments. It's sustained, unremarkable consistency over meaningful time, precisely because this is exactly what the previous violation revealed she cannot adequately assess through any other method. And this brings us to the final, most important piece of understanding this specific, unforgivable mistake. Not simply why it happens or how it affects the relationship it occurs within, but what it ultimately teaches a super empath about herself, about trust, and about the specific kind of wisdom that emerges once she's fully processed and integrated exactly what this particular violation revealed. Because here's what ultimately emerges once enough time has passed for this specific betrayal to be fully processed rather than simply survived. A super empath doesn't actually become permanently incapable of trust. What she becomes is someone with a fundamentally clearer understanding of what trust actually requires in order to be safe, rather than simply comfortable. This distinction matters enormously, and it's worth examining directly, because it resolves what might otherwise seem like a contradiction at the center of this entire conversation. If this specific mistake is genuinely unforgivable, if it produces the kind of permanent, structural change we've spent this entire conversation describing, does that mean a super empath who has experienced this betrayal is simply doomed to permanent guardedness, unable to ever again extend the kind of full, vulnerable trust that makes genuine intimacy possible? The answer, once you understand what actually happened psychologically, is more nuanced than either extreme. She doesn't lose her capacity for trust. She loses her willingness to extend it based on the same criteria that previously seemed sufficient but proved, through painful experience, to be inadequate. This is different from permanent closure. It's recalibration toward a more rigorous, more reliable standard, one that requires more time, more consistency, and more specific kinds of evidence before full vulnerability becomes available again. But that remains, crucially, genuinely available to anyone willing to meet that higher standard through sustained, demonstrated reliability. This is why the person who committed this specific betrayal almost never gets the opportunity to be the one who meets this new standard, and understanding why reveals something important about how forgiveness and trust actually differ from each other, a distinction we've touched on in previous conversations, but that becomes especially crucial here. A super empath can eventually release her anger towards someone who deceived her in this specific way. She can, with enough time and processing, understand the context that led them to choose deception, even develop something resembling compassion for whatever fear or insecurity drove that choice. This represents genuine forgiveness, in the sense of releasing the corrosive weight of ongoing resentment. But forgiveness, as we discussed extensively in a previous conversation, doesn't require restored access. She can forgive the person completely while still, permanently, declining to extend the specific kind of unverified trust that person violated. This isn't punitive, it's simply accurate, informed decision-making based on demonstrated evidence about what this specific person is actually capable of when trust has been fully extended to them. The forgiveness is real. The permanent boundary is equally real. Both can exist simultaneously without contradiction once you understand that trust and forgiveness were never actually the same thing in the first place. Here's what becomes possible, though, for someone new entering a super empath's life after this specific betrayal has occurred and been fully processed. Genuine trust remains completely available, but it now requires something the previous relationship apparently didn't. Sustained demonstration across enough varied circumstances, enough time, enough consistency between stated values and actual behavior, that the evidence becomes significantly more difficult to fake through calculated performance alone. This higher standard isn't a punishment for new people entering her life. It's simply the direct, logical consequence of having learned, through genuine pain, exactly how much evidence her previous standard actually required in order to be reliable. This is ultimately what makes this specific mistake so significant, so much more consequential than almost any other harm a super empath might experience and eventually move past completely. It doesn't just end one relationship. It teaches her something permanent about the actual mechanics of trust itself, information that becomes foundational to every subsequent relationship she builds moving forward. protecting her in ways the person who caused this specific pain never intended, but that ultimately serves her far better than the more easily satisfied trust she extended before this violation occurred. If you recognize this pattern in your own history, if there's a specific person, a specific betrayal, a specific moment where earned trust was deliberately violated in a way that produced permanent, structural change in how you approach vulnerability now, understand exactly what that permanent change actually represents. It's not damage in the sense of something broken that needs fixing. It's wisdom, hard-earned and precious, that now protects you from ever again mistaking calculated performance for the genuine, demonstrated consistency that actually makes vulnerability safe. You don't owe anyone access to the specific kind of unverified trust that was once violated, regardless of how much time has passed, regardless of how sincere their subsequent accountability might seem. That specific door can remain permanently closed while every other door, every future relationship built on genuinely earned trust through genuinely demonstrated consistency remains completely, fully open. This is what it actually means to survive the one mistake a super empath never forgives. Not permanent closure, not permanent inability to trust again. Simply, finally, a clearer, more accurate understanding of exactly what trust requires in order to be worth extending. An understanding that protects everything you build afterward, precisely because you finally know, through painful, direct experience, exactly what you're actually protecting it from. Thanks for watching.